0000. I'll
Repeat that again. It's 0207 00.
Intercepted or discovered.
I mentioned that we're expecting a press conference in Afghanistan. People naturally are consumed with the day-to-day news as they see it and do not always read the foreign pages of their newspaper and might only remember the history only vaguely. Can you put into some sort of context for us briefly the relationship between the Mujahideen, Afghanistan and the US government?
Well, let's remember though that the group which may be responsible for this, we obviously don't know yet,
yes.
The group linked to Osama bin Laden, is not at heart an Afghan group. It's an Islamic group which has links in the US, in the UK, in France, all over the Middle East. And although some of the members are Afghani, others are Saudi, Egyptian, Palestinian. So it's very much a multinational conglomerate. They happen at the moment of the last few years to have found a conducive home in Afghanistan for two reasons. Partly because Afghanistan is still at war with itself. There's still a civil war in Afghanistan, and that provides a very fertile recruiting and training ground for these Mujahideen. But secondly, of course, the current government over most of Afghanistan, the Taliban, is not recognized by most Western governments. Ideologically, it is opposed both to Zionism and to what they call Western imperialism, and therefore, unsurprisingly, it supports the general ideological aims of Osama bin Laden to oppose Western influence and to improve the position of Muslims around the world. So there are some links, obviously, between bin Laden and the Taliban government.
We heard from our correspondent in Israel that Osama bin Laden had denied any involvement with this attack. Are we to trust his denial, or should we be sceptical?
No, I think we should be sceptical, but cautiously sceptical. There has been a trend in the last few years of terrorist acts, particularly mass terrorism. We just have to remember Lockerbie, where no group claims responsibility, and this has been a change since the 1970s. So we may well find that with this operation, there may well be claims of responsibility, but the real people behind this may not actually want to admit to it because they know they'll be punished by the US and by its allies. Even if Osama bin Laden himself was not involved in this, that's not the way his group works. His group is a very loose network. It's not a hierarchy. It's a very loose, fragmented network, and although he may have had some knowledge of this in general terms, the people who actually, his lieutenants who may have carried out this sort of operation, wouldn't necessarily have filled him in on the details. So it could well be the case that he didn't know the details of this, even if some of his colleagues were carrying it out.
For now, Dr. Andrew Rathmell, an analyst in terrorism, thank you very much for your expertise. Thank you for joining us. We're going to go now live to Helen Wright in the newsroom. After you hear from Helen, my colleague Dermot Murnaghan will be joining you.
Well, let me tell you the latest information I have from the States. I'm now told that the United States of America is on a coast-to-coast state of alert and that the President and his senior advisors are meeting. They've set up what they call a situation room in the White House where these attacks in New York and Washington are now being discussed. The Mayor of New York has warned that a tremendous number of lives have been lost in these attacks. We're now fearing that thousands of people have been killed. I have some new information on the second plane that was involved in the attack on the World Trade Center towers. The first one believed to be a Boeing 767 flying from Boston to Los Angeles. The second one, we believe, was a plane flown out of Newark, of course not terribly far from Manhattan. Let me tell you a little bit now about the wider implications. Here in London, Canary Wharf has been evacuated, the NatWest Tower has been evacuated, Lloyd's of London and the London Stock Exchange have been evacuated, and of course in New York the financial markets have closed down indefinitely. Obviously the situation in New York is having a tremendous knock-on effect for international air travel. Flights from France to the US have been cancelled. Flights from Germany have been halted. Alitalia has recalled flights that were en route to the US. And all Virgin flights, I've told, have now been recalled. All Virgin flights that were en route to the US have been recalled in response to events in New York and Washington today. I'm also just being told that Israel has said it's withdrawing its diplomats from the US. So the latest information, a coast-to-coast state of alert in America, knock-on implications worldwide, with major financial centres in London being evacuated and huge implications for international air travel, though of course that is not foremost in our minds this afternoon when we fear that so many people will have died in these incidents in the United States.
That, Helen Wright, as you say, an event with global ramifications, and thanks also to my colleague Kirsty Young for talking us through the early hours of this devastating attack on the United States of America. Let's look back now over the terrible events and dramatic pictures of the last 3 hours. One plane had already hit the World Trade Center in New York when news crews scrambled and began filming the smoke and flames pouring out from one of the Twin Towers. While they were filming, a second plane, there we see it, crashed into the other tower. That set off a huge explosion and resulting fire. Shortly after that, there was a third attack. This one was not in New York, but in the heart of America, Washington, D.C., on the Pentagon buildings, the headquarters of the U.S. military and intelligence services. Fire crews were quickly on the scene there to try to cope with the flames. Then, back in New York, we can see here pictures of the collapse of one of the towers, the first of the towers of the World Trade Center, with huge clouds of dust engulfing much of central and lower Manhattan. Then came the collapse, the dramatic collapse of the second tower of the World Trade Center, changing forever the New York skyline, one of its most famous landmarks, gone for good. The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center have been destroyed in a terrorist attack. There you can see the dust, the clouds of dust, hundreds of feet high, engulfing New York. One can only imagine what it was like there for people on the ground. Inevitably, people would have gathered to have watched and witnessed that scene, pushed back by the fire crews and police. But those clouds of smoke and dust engulfing much of Manhattan. As we say, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center have collapsed after being hit by two hijacked passenger aircraft. One took off from Boston on its way to Los Angeles. A Boeing 767 crashed into one of the towers. The other tower was hit, we believe, by a Boeing 737, one a United Airlines plane, the other an American Airlines plane. No British airline is involved in that. These pictures we have, as you can see, were taken earlier, but not that much earlier. This all happened just about an hour ago, the collapse of the towers. It was just shortly before 2 o'clock our time, early in the morning in the United States, just before 9 o'clock in Manhattan, when those attacks took place. These are, now we're cutting to those live pictures of New York, and look at the pall of smoke and dust that has engulfed the entire parts of Manhattan. That's a mixture of the fires still burning around the remains of the World Trade Center down in lower Manhattan, dust from the huge towers. We've got to imagine how tall those buildings were, how much dust and debris and rubble that has been thrown up, and we can only imagine at this moment how many people have perished in this attack. Also an attack as well in Washington, D.C., where we're going now to join our correspondent there, James Mates. James, behind you, of course, the burning Pentagon. What can you tell us from there?
It's difficult to establish exactly what happened here, except that eyewitnesses do say that an aircraft crashed into the Pentagon. You can see the smoke still rising from over there behind me. Crashed initially into a helicopter landing pad and then struck the building. There has been a major fire there. Part of the Pentagon has collapsed. Now, beyond that, we don't have any details. It's not clear what the aircraft was or where it was coming from. We do know that two American Airlines jets have been involved in today's incidents. One was flying from Boston to Los Angeles. The other was flying from here in Washington to Los Angeles. It may be significant that they were both big jets, would both have been very full of fuel before starting that cross-country journey across to the West Coast. We know that both those aircraft have been lost. American Airlines have reported that. It's not clear whether they are both the ones that went into the World Trade Center or not. There is another air crash southeast of Pittsburgh. That, we are told, is a 747 jumbo jet operated by United Airlines on its way to Chicago, I understand. Now, those three jets are confirmed missing. Whether there is a fourth one involved here at the Pentagon is still not absolutely clear, but it looks like it.
Just say for our audience here that we're expecting a statement very shortly, another statement from the Prime Minister, Tony Blair. He's already spoken on the issue at the TUC conference in Brighton. We are expecting another statement shortly, as I say. Now, James Mates in Washington, what about the President? He, of course, is crucial in all this, in the coordination of dealing with this. We saw him speak on the ground in California on the issue. We then saw him boarding Air Force One, presumably not back in Washington yet.
Not back in Washington yet, indeed, but will nonetheless, it has full communications, obviously, aboard Air Force One, will be in very close contact with his Defense Secretary, his National Security Advisor, and the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, assessing the situation and trying to coordinate a response, as well, of course, as trying to find the words to express the nation's total and utter shock and disbelief at what has happened here. The worst attack in history on the continental United States. The emblematic building, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, so symbolic of both New York City and of the United States and its global superpower status, destroyed. The Pentagon hit the very center of American military power.
Okay, James Mates live in Washington for the time being. Thanks very much. Do keep us posted. There we see now live pictures of the of the attacks in the United States on New York City. The World Trade Center has been attacked and destroyed by a terrorist attack. Now, we understand that the Duchess of York is in New York today. Her charity apparently has an office in one of the towers of the World Trade Center. She was due, according to her diary, to visit 2 of the workers there today. They have got out, we've been told, and the Duchess is also reported to be safe, although we don't know her whereabouts within New York at the moment. Now, we have some reaction from the streets of New York to this devastating attack.
What tower were you in, ma'am?
We're in the, what are we in, 3 World Financial Center. We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know. And I don't know, everybody just doesn't know where to go. They won't let, everything is blocked off. You can't even, they're telling us to get out, but there's nowhere to go. And then I heard that another plane hit, and if you go over by there, you can see the people jumping out the window. They're jumping out the window right now. Oh my God.
All right, we're standing in front of the Soho Grand Hotel, and the doorman, I'm with the fire alarm company, the doorman goes to me, wow, I never seen a plane flying so low. And we looked out at it, all of a sudden, boom, it seemed like it wasn't even real. And we came running over here closer to the place, and all of a sudden we saw the other explosion. I don't know.
Everything just went black. Everything came down, glass started popping. People got hurt, stuff went on top of them. And it was a big explosion. Everything got dark, real dark, like snow. You can see behind me, oh, this is not snow, this is all from the building. It was a terrible nightmare.
I was in B Tower. A Tower.
What floor were you on?
B1.
What floor?
First one.
What happened? Tell me.
When a big explosion happened, some guy came out, his skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
Anything else that you saw? Were you there for the second hit by the plane?
About 10 minutes later, the second building went off.
Did you see it?
Yes, I saw it. It just blew up. A big explosion. People started running. It was just chaos everywhere. Yes, I was right there. I was down in the basement. Came down. All of a sudden, the elevator blew up. Smoke. I dragged the guy out. His skin was hanging off, and I dragged him out, and I helped him out to the ambulance.
Shock, terror, confusion, and horror there. Eyewitness reaction from the streets of New York to the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. A double plane hijacking. The planes then crashed into the World Trade Center, the towers subsequently collapsing. A third attack on the Pentagon in Washington, the heart of the American military establishment, and a reported fourth attack in the industrial city of Pittsburgh. I should also say to you that those of you who are expecting normal programming on ITV1 will find that continuing on ITV2. Now, I'm joined by Dr. Andrew Rathmell, an analyst in terrorism from the RAND Corporation in Europe. Dr. Rathmell, We have talked about this, assuming that it is an attack by Arab terrorists. That is the natural reaction. This building was attacked before in 1993. But let's not forget the Oklahoma bombing. This, of course, was domestic. Is that a possibility?
Of course it's a possibility, because we have no evidence as yet, but it's very, very unlikely. The Oklahoma attack was a one-off. There were only a very small group of terrorists involved in that, one of whom has now been executed,
Timothy
of course,
McVeigh.
Timothy McVeigh. So those groups have lost a lot of power, a lot of influence over the last few years, and there's no evidence that they have the capacity to mount this sort of operation. Let's just make sure, though, that we don't use the term Arab here, in the sense that the previous attack on the World Trade Center was carried out by Islamist groups, right. Some of whom were Arab, but obviously not all of the members of these groups are Arabs. The motivation is political Islam in some cases, rather than Arab nationalism. And we've already seen one group claiming responsibility. Do you give that any credence? Naturally, in these events, you get lots and lots of different groups, splinter groups, trying to say that they did it. And you get, in the first few hours, a lot of confusion, because on the one side, that group, the Democratic Front, did appear to claim responsibility. A little later in the day, it appeared to reject responsibility. That group, in fact, I think, is a group which has carried out very few major terrorist attacks in the last few years. So it seems quite unlikely to have been seriously involved in this. And in fact, I would be quite surprised if any organised group really put its hand to its heart and said, we did this, because they'll be very vulnerable to retaliation. There we are seeing now live pictures of the Pentagon still smoking some hours after the attack there. How will this have affected the United States' ability to deal with the immediate crisis and then, of course, the ongoing situation? The immediate crisis, the attack on the Pentagon, obviously depending exactly where it hit, shouldn't cause too many problems, because most of the agencies involved in immediate response and 24-hour response are local agencies or are coordinated by, for example, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Authority, not necessarily out of the Pentagon. And indeed, many of the military activities that are now required won't need to be coordinated from the Pentagon. There are local activities. So in the short term, this shouldn't be too much of a problem. In the longer term, of course, the Pentagon and the American intelligence services will start planning on how to...
Well, in terms of casualties, of course, as you can gauge, simply from looking at these pictures, extremely difficult to even begin to gauge the number of casualties. But we can tell you that the mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, has spoken in the last hour or so of a tremendous loss of life, as he called it. Well, here in London, the City of London has been evacuated. All trading was suspended on the stock exchange. There has also been no trading across the United States. In terms of who was possibly behind these acts of terrorism, there was earlier in the afternoon an anonymous call to television in Abu Dhabi claiming that a group called the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine was behind these attacks on America. That was the initial claim. That, however, has... And very shortly they're due to issue a presidential order which would restructure how they dealt with terrorism. So this will obviously get more currency. We're looking at live shots from Washington of the Pentagon there after the attack there, but of course there we are seeing as well that much of the City of London here in the United Kingdom has been evacuated. The global ramifications of this should not be underestimated. What kind of effect could it have economically? We were talking about already being on the edge of a stock market crash. It's already had a huge effect, of course, on the United States trading naturally, but of course around the globe. What could this do? It will have a serious effect. I think only short-term effect, but it will have a serious effect because obviously the World Trade Center and indeed the area around it is crucial in terms of the operation of the world stock market and financial centers. So it will disrupt that activity, and indeed if parts of London, parts of the city are closed down, that will be another disruptive factor to the world economy. And one suspects in cities around the globe there are similar security thoughts being had there. Absolutely. So I remember after the Gulf War or during the Gulf War in 1991, again the effect there, many Americans refusing to travel. Airlines were seen to be dangerous. This presumably will have a similar and if not larger effect. Well indeed, because remember during the Gulf War it was the fact that Americans were afraid to travel to Europe and the UK because they were seen as being terrorist hotbeds. This is happening in the heart of the US. So there is already a degree of paranoia in the United States about terrorism, which may well lead to overreaction. This is clearly going to fuel that paranoia quite justifiably. And there, of course, the picture which will be fueling that paranoia, as you say, a live picture from New York this Tuesday afternoon.
completely engulfed, almost obliterated the skyline of New York City, the most famous city in the whole wide world. We can virtually not see it after the collapse of the World Trade Center. We just lost the picture there. Let's see if we can get it back. We are now seeing Washington, D.C., the lawn, I believe, of the Pentagon building, and evacuation having taken place there. We don't know what effect that will have on the United States military's ability to deal with this. But of course, Andrew Rathmell, the United States will want to, as quickly as possible, establish who did this and take a necessary response.
It will, and remember that some of the US agencies were on a heightened state of alert, so they had received some warnings of some sort of operation going to take place. So we'd expect the Americans, working with their allies in London, in Israel, to have a fairly good idea early on of the sort of groups that may have been behind this. The question is then actually tracking down those individuals.
Now, we were talking about responsibility. There is one claim of responsibility, the DFLP. Can you tell us a little bit about this grouping?
Yes, the DFLP is a socialist, leftist, Arab nationalist group which emerged out of the Palestinian movement in the 1960s. In fact, it hasn't actually carried out much terrorism over the last 10 years. It mainly operates in Lebanon and inside Israel, or the occupied territories, carrying out relatively small operations against settlers and against Israeli troops.
So more of a political grouping than a military one?
This is mainly nowadays a political grouping, but it does actually oppose the peace process at the moment. It opposes the American-sponsored peace process in the Middle East.
Would you say, off the top of your head, obviously, whether that group would have the capability of carrying out such a massive attack? It must have been months, if not years, in the planning.
There's no evidence that they had. Certainly, if you go back to the 1980s, there is evidence that they had the ability to carry out plane bombings and hijackings across Europe. They had coordinated cells. There's been little evidence recently that they've tried to regain that capacity. And I would say to carry out this operation, they would certainly have had to ally with another group, possibly an Islamist group, to get the funds necessary to carry out this operation.
One can only imagine the sheer impact of the pictures that we're now seeing live from New York City on the American public. They now must feel this in their heartland. New York, nowhere is safe.
Absolutely, and this, you see, this is a classic terrorist attack, that the symbols that were targeted were the symbols right at the heart of American power, political and military and economic power. This is really the ultimate symbolic terrorism act.
To think through the process in which it was carried out, clearly there has to be hijacking at the core of this to get these passenger airliners to fly into the building. But nevertheless, you are holding a gun presumably at a pilot's head and telling him to commit suicide, unless they had the ability to fly those planes themselves.
Which could well have been the case, because many of these groups are well funded. They have plenty of technicians, they have pilots, they have aircrew, or they have the ability to contract in those skills. So that's no problem. Obviously, what is required from a terrorist point of view is a willingness by one or more terrorists to commit suicide. We've seen in Lebanon and in the West Bank the willingness of young, untrained, ill-educated people to do that. What I think is interesting in here, we have obviously had some highly trained, highly committed terrorists who are also willing to sacrifice their lives, probably more than one on each aircraft, I would have thought.
Dr. Rathmell, for the time being, thank you very much indeed for that insight. We will, of course, keep exploring those possibilities as the afternoon and early evening wear on. You're seeing live shots from the United States of America, where there have been 2 confirmed attacks in different cities, 2 separate attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City by hijacked passenger airliners, which eventually then brought about the collapse of those massive office blocks, and another attack in Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, an attack on the Pentagon there. Let's now go to the ITV newsroom, and our correspondent Helen Wright is monitoring events there. Helen, what more can you tell us? Can you bring us up to date?
Well, American Airlines has now confirmed that it has lost 2 aircraft, between them carrying 156 people in these attacks today. And United Airlines has now grounded all its operations worldwide in response to what's happened in New York and Washington. Of course, worldwide revulsion is being expressed at these horrifying attacks. Within the last few minutes, the Queen has expressed her disbelief and total shock at the events in New York and Washington. The Russian President Vladimir Putin has expressed deep sympathy to the people of America. In Berlin, the Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder has expressed shock and disbelief, and in Brussels, Chris Patton has said that the people in Europe are watching events with absolute horror. We're getting reports from the United States that the national and international phone networks are completely jammed with people desperately trying to get in touch with their loved ones to tell them that they are okay. And here in the UK, an emergency number has been published for anyone who's worried about friends and family in New York and Washington. And that number, if I can give it to you, Dermot, is...
Well, it's a pretty horrible event, all put together, but we should not be particularly surprised by it. If one looks at the track record of terrorism against the US in recent years, right from the initial attack on the World Trade Center in 1993, through the attacks on American facilities in Saudi Arabia in 95 and 96, the attack on the embassies in East Africa in 98, and of course the attack on the USS Cole in Aden in November of 2000.
The Prime Minister has just returned to Whitehall. There we are. We weren't quite sure whether to expect a press briefing there from Mr. Blair or not. He's decided not at the moment. I apologise, Mr. Wiley. We just wanted to go very briefly there to Downing Street to see those pictures of Tony Blair coming back to London. You were giving us your reaction to the events of today.
Yeah, well, they are shocking events, but there is a track record of, we suspect, Islamic terrorism against the US. It's very hard to exaggerate the degree of profound resentment, particularly at street level in the Middle East, against the West. One can even take it back, it sounds fanciful, 1,000 years, and you look to the Crusades and you look at a whole sequence of events since then, which seems to have been to the detriment of ordinary people. We shouldn't deceive ourselves. This will be applauded in the slums of Cairo and Beirut and Damascus, and of course in the refugee camps in the West Bank and in Lebanon. And the repercussions of this could rebound throughout the area. If I was
on board. A second aircraft, Flight 77 from Washington to Los Angeles, had 64 people on board. Meanwhile, United Airlines said one plane with 45 people on board, that's Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco, crashed near Pittsburgh. And another of its aircraft, which had 65 people on board, was lost on its way on a flight from Boston to Los Angeles. United didn't know where Flight 175 had crashed. Well, live now to our correspondent Robert Hall, who is at Heathrow Airport. Robert.
Things across the continent have been evacuated and millions of phone lines on the East Coast have been crippled. Tonight, America is in shock. Panic fills the air. Thousands are dead. Millions must mourn. In the history of the United States, there has hardly been a day as black.
Mark Easton. James Rubin, President Clinton's Assistant Secretary of State, is in West London. General Sir Michael Rose, who commanded the UN Protection Force in Bosnia, is in Bristol. Professor Paul Rogers, a terrorism expert, is in Leeds. James Rubin, I want to take you to the office that you occupied, the State Department. It's evacuated. Every single one of your colleagues has been evacuated. This is something unimaginable.
Well, it really is. I think all of us who served in government understood that Washington was always, in a sense, a target. We took certain steps to protect ourselves, but every day I looked out of my window at the State Department, I never dreamed that a group of terrorists would be able to so completely affect the United States by destroying these buildings in New York, and now obviously by trying to attack Washington itself. It's certainly the worst terrorist incident in history, but I believe it's an attack not just on the United States. An attack on the World Trade Center is an attack on all the civilized countries of the world, and all the civilized countries of the world should see it that way.
Was this a scenario, a terrorist scenario, beyond anything that had been planned for?
Well, I don't think that this is beyond imagining. I think it's certainly beyond what anyone expected. We had seen the World Trade Center attacked before. An attempt was made to blow it up. So we knew that at the time there were discussions when certain of these terrorists were brought in for indictment that they had tried to take over a number of aircraft and conduct spectacular raids. So I don't think it was beyond the imagining, but I don't recall this particular scenario being discussed as one we had expected.
I wonder if you can put yourself back, cast your mind back to when you were in office. How do you think your colleagues who are still working there are actually feeling? What are they going through, do you think?
Well, government in a crisis is an extremely stressful enterprise, even without the kind of threat to the United States directly. I remember very stressful moments when the United States was in conflict in Kosovo, for example, but that pales in comparison when you know that somebody, your family members or friends or colleagues might well have been in those buildings in New York, and to watch them collapse before your very eyes on the television set really brings home the power of terrorists to damage the lives of free peoples. And we are a free people, and it's because we're a free people that terrorists can operate. It's not a closed society, and it's one of the privileges but also the pains of being a free people, as all of your viewers here in London know from the period of terrorism here in London.
James Rubin, stay with us for a moment. I'd like now to move to General Sir Michael Rose. Sir Michael, you only know in a sense what we know. I mean, we have this overview of what's happened, but we don't have the intimate detail, but I think we've got a pretty good idea of what's happened. What's your kind of military assessment of what has actually happened?
Well, I think in a way we need to go forward, and although inevitably there will be analysis of how these attacks happened and what we could do to stop them happening again in the same way, I think we need, once the natural feelings of horror and revulsion of these terrible events today have passed by, we need to step back and look at the long-term strategic consequences of these events, because what is certain is that the world will not be the same place again in the future. And I think we need to take a considered view about how we're going to respond. I think striking out with cruise missiles to suspected targets around the world is the last thing we should be doing at the moment.
Well, no, I mean, what we seem to know is that this was a coordinated attack by at least 4 hijacked airliners. The very fact that an airliner can be hijacked, can be driven at a target, that the captain can be made to do it, although our sense is that perhaps in Pennsylvania the pilot may have crashed the plane deliberately to prevent taking it into Washington. A great act of heroism, perhaps, we don't know. But surely this is displaying a level of sophistication that even you must have doubted existed within the terrorist fold.
Well, I think it is a surprise that a group of people were able to achieve these terrifying events, which do have long-term strategic consequences, without any advanced knowledge amongst intelligence communities around the world. Also, questions are going to have to be asked as to how the weapons were got on board these aircraft, because my view is that the pilots didn't fly into these buildings with guns held to their heads. They were probably killed. Suicidal terrorists then took over the controls and flew them in. And as you say, it didn't work in one case. But there's a whole lot of immediate questions that need to be asked. But standing back a bit, I think the strategic imperatives are altered dramatically. I think, first of all, defence organisations around the world need to reassess their priorities. Since the end of the Cold War, we've been embarked on a whole series of very honourable peacekeeping operations, humanitarian intervention operations, and only a lip service has been paid to the threat of weapons of mass destruction being used by terrorists, or as we see here, normal items that are available to everybody in a day-to-day life, modern society, being used to destroy the centre of the commercial centre of the world.
But what does that mean in practice? Because, I mean, actually getting into the mind of a terrorist and devising mechanisms to stall him or her is a very tall order, and one which has defeated many people before us.
Well, of course, there's no such thing as total security, but I think we can do a whole lot better than we've been doing in the past. As I said, I think only lip service has been paid in the past. I think we should be investing a considerable, greater effort in gathering intelligence, both human and technical. I think we can put in place a lot of technical devices, better ones, to prevent these sorts of incidents happening, because it'll be more difficult for terrorists to get their weapons onto airplanes, etc.
What about the missile defence shield? That comes into play in this?
Well, I think the missile defence shield's got absolutely nothing to do with any of this. I think it's taken the eye off what is, as Prime Minister Tony Blair said, the modern evil of terrorism, mass terrorism. And I think he needs to focus his mind on that. He needs to put the resources into his own defence and foreign policies, which will produce better responses than we've had hitherto. And I know that democratic countries, freedom of movement, the globalisation of world markets, all these things make it terribly easy for the terrorists to do this.
Right.
we must address the problem.
Well, stay with us too, please. Let me just turn now to Professor Paul Rogers, and your business is more peace than war, and I'm wondering whether, from your perspective, looking at peace studies, I mean, how on earth does the world gird its loins against this kind of action?
I think with terrible difficulty. There was an assumption when the Cold War ended that we would move into a more stable, more peaceful world. Instead, over the last 10 or 12 years, if anything, there has been greater instability and more violence, particularly in many parts of the Middle East. There has also been an assumption that very powerful military states, the Western liberal democracies, could defend themselves and could maintain order. And what we've seen today with these terrible pictures from the United States is that there is something terribly wrong with that analysis, and we don't seem to have a real handle on the real way the world is going.
So, I mean, in practical terms, where do you see the great change of emphasis coming, and how is it manifest?
I think one of the things we have to recognize, and it's terribly difficult to say it at a time like this, is that there is bitter anti-Western feeling in many parts of the world, especially in the Middle East. We can, of course, condemn this terrible atrocity, this series of atrocities today, but if, as I think Sir Michael said, we respond just in a kind of blind retaliation, we're not even beginning to get an idea of what is actually happening in the world and the way the divisions are actually deepening. It's not the time to be talking this way in many ways because we have so many people who've died and so much suffering, but the worst thing that could happen would be for a kind of increase in the polarization consequent on this terrible disaster. We have to stand back and try and work out what are the root causes of the motivations of such people and what are the environments from which they come. If we don't do that, the net effect will be more of this kind of disaster in the future.
James Rubin, when your president, Clinton, was in the White House, Sudan was bombed for a much lesser violation than this. What does President Bush do? What do we think he'll do?
Well, obviously, I would be speculating. Let's assume that Osama bin Laden, who is the prime candidate, whose supporters and other groups have been talking about these kind of spectacular attacks on the United States for some time. Let's assume he was responsible. I don't accept the idea that the answer to that is to change our policy on the Middle East, as your previous guest suggested. The answer to that is that these are evil men. These are people who are put to death, tens of thousands perhaps of innocent civilians from all over the world who might have been in the World Trade Center. And those evil people need to be rooted out directly. And military force should not be ruled out. And just because the cruise missile attacks in the past weren't successful in deterring a second attack, I think we have to be very, very clear that this is an attack on the United States of massive proportions, and the idea that the United States is not going to respond, find out who was responsible, bring them to justice or destroy them is not serious.
But very briefly, what about attending to the discomfort and the distress of the people behind whose skirts these terrorists hide? Surely there has to be a greater engagement. If anything, surely since Bill Clinton left the White House, there has been a lesser engagement.
Well, I don't think this is a time for me to be criticizing my president, but I will say this. There are plenty of things we can do in the Middle East to improve the situation, but at the height of the peace process, when President Clinton was shepherding the Prime Minister of Israel and the Chairman Arafat towards a permanent peace, Al-Qaeda, the organization of Osama bin Laden, was still operating, even when the Palestinian people were 80% against suicide bombers because the peace process was bearing fruit. The Al-Qaeda organization of Osama bin Laden was operating and trying to conduct these kind of organizations. So changing our foreign policy to make it more palatable to some in the Middle East is not going to change the minds of these madmen.
James Rubin, thank you very much indeed. General Sir Michael Rose, thank you too. And Professor, if you would stay with us, please, we'll be looking a little later at who really may have perpetrated this atrocity. Well, we just got further pictures of the scene now in Pennsylvania, the plane which crashed about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. One local politician said it was apparently intended to hit Camp David, which is the presidential retreat in the state of Maryland. The plane was the United Airlines Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco with 38 people on board. We'll be giving you an emergency phone number at the Foreign Office later in the program for relatives to contact them in case there's any anxiety about people in New York, Pennsylvania, or anywhere else. You're watching Channel 4 News tonight.
The aircraft hitting the World Trade Center towers at 9 o'clock this morning, American time. Jeff, I suppose this is in a way the very symbol not just of American capitalism but of world capitalism, because everybody who's anybody in business in the world has somebody in those buildings.
Exactly. For those who haven't been to New York, it's important to understand that the World Trade Center is at the heart of Wall Street. It's downtown Manhattan. It dominates that area, and so threatening to the world economy because it's what it represents. People see these pictures and they strike at the heart of the world economy, and they really do get frightened, and probably for good reason.
And that's a very important point, because both the Prime Minister and the American President have made it clear that they believe this is not just an attack on the United States. This is an attack on freedom. This is an attack on the Western way of life, for want of a better phrase. And that is clearly what has happened. That's not mere rhetoric, is it?
No, that is not hype. It's for real. I mean, clearly the intention today was to kill lots of people, but it wasn't. I don't think that was at the heart of the mission, because you could have killed lots of people by suicide missions all over America. What this is seeking to do is to destroy the financial system, is to bring the Western world to a grinding and shuddering halt. They really do want to produce a shock that will make all the Western countries sit up and say, we've got to listen to whatever your complaints are.
So President Bush tonight is faced with some kind of terrorist crisis, which some are likening to a war, an active war. He's also faced with a potential for this to develop into some kind of economic crisis.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. I don't like being this gloomy, but there's no point being unrealistic. American confidence up until this point was very weak. Consumers were beginning to lose confidence because unemployment figures were rising. Companies have been slashing back investment for some time, laying off workers, and as we know, the whole dot-com bubble burst some time ago. America was on the brink, and the discussion was, could it be dragged back from the brink by the Federal Reserve and Alan Greenspan? My personal fear is that this, with what it will do to American consumer confidence, could tip the country and therefore the whole world into a pretty deep recession.
Terribly gloomy day. Jeff, thanks very much for your perspective on all this. Karen.
Now, recent bombings in London mean that Britain's already on a high state of terrorist alert.
Salomon Building, 47 stories high, obviously empty by this stage in the day. Structurally weakened, following on from the explosions and the earthquake-like aftershocks caused by the explosions and the two aeroplanes slamming into the buildings next door. We've also received the latest video footage, amateur, of one of the Boeing jets flying in to the World Trade Center towers. The shot zooms in. There we are. Amateur video footage of that Boeing aircraft going into the side of one of the World Trade Center towers.